In one Vienna maternity ward, women were dying at a rate the hospital could count. In the ward next door, they were not. Same building, same city, same kind of patients, different hands. Ignaz Semmelweis found the pattern, changed the procedure, and watched mortality collapse. The evidence did not fail. The profession did. Accepting his result meant accepting that physicians themselves had been carrying death from the autopsy room to the delivery bed. To see why that was so hard to admit, start inside the hospital that already had the numbers. In the 1840s, the Vienna General Hospital was one of Europe's major teaching hospitals. Its maternity service was divided into two divisions, both delivering babies, both operating under the same institutional roof. The first division was staffed by medical students and physicians. The second division was staffed by midwives. The death rates told a story no one wanted to read. Between 1841 and 1846, the mortality rate in the first division averaged about 10%. Women feared assignment to the first clinic, and Semmelweis later pointed to the lower mortality reported among so-called street births as part of the puzzle. Over the same 6-year span, the second division's mortality rate was under 4%. This was not a subtle difference. In 1846, the first clinic's mortality rate was about 5 times the second's. Across the 6-year span, it was roughly 3 times as high. The hospital's leadership had explanations: overcrowding, atmospheric conditions, a mysterious miasma specific to the first division's location. The emotional distress caused by the presence of a male priest who rang a bell when passing through the ward to administer last rites, a sound some theorized frightened, susceptible women into fatal decline. None of these explanations survived contact with the data. Semmelweis examined all of them. In March 1847, a colleague of Semmelweis named Jakob Kolečka died. Kolečka was a professor of forensic medicine. During a teaching autopsy, a student's scalpel cut his finger. Within days, he developed sepsis. The pathology described at his autopsy closely resembled what physicians were seeing in fatal cases of childbed fever. Semmelweis recognized it immediately. The first division physicians and students moved between the autopsy room and the maternity ward as a matter of routine. They performed dissections on cadavers, and then, without effective disinfection, proceeded to examine laboring women. The second division midwives did not perform autopsies. They had no contact with cadavers. The difference between the wards was not location, not atmosphere, not the emotional distress of a bell. It was the hands of the people conducting examinations. Semmelweis introduced a requirement. Before examining any patient, physicians and students had to wash their hands in a chloride of lime solution, not plain soap and water. A chemical agent strong enough to remove what he called cadaverous particles, the material he believed was being transferred from the dead to the living. The results were immediate. Within weeks, mortality in the first division fell sharply. By 1848, the annual death rate in the first clinic was about 1.3%. Essentially identical to the second. To understand what happened next, you have to understand what the evidence actually required the profession to believe. The first layer, 2 maternity wards produced radically different death rates. This was not a hypothesis. It was a documented record spanning years. The data existed before Semmelweis arrived. The gap was visible to everyone with access to the hospital's mortality ledgers. No one disputed the numbers. What was disputed was their meaning. The gap between the clinics should have demanded explanation on its own terms. Instead, it accumulated interpretations that preserved the assumption that the cause was environmental, something outside the physicians themselves. The second layer. Semmelweis connected the pattern to physician contact after autopsies. The logic of his inference was not difficult. The 2 wards differed in one operationally significant way: the professional activities of their staff. Midwives delivered babies. Physicians delivered babies and dissected corpses. Kolečka's death gave Semmelweis the mechanism, or at least the plausible pathway. Something was being carried from the autopsy room on unwashed hands. The reasoning was observable, testable, and grounded in a specific institutional difference that had been present from the beginning. The third layer, hand-washing sharply reduced mortality. The intervention was not theoretical. It produced results within weeks that were visible in the ward zone records. By 1848, the 1st Division's annual death rate had fallen to about 1.3% after the chloride of lime wash was introduced. This is the point in the story where a data-driven discipline should have moved decisively. The numbers had changed. The variable that changed them was identified. The evidence was not ambiguous. The fourth layer. Because the mechanism was not yet understood, the profession could dismiss the result. Germ theory did not yet exist as an established scientific framework. Semmelweis could identify that something was being transferred on unwashed hands, but he could not name a pathogen or explain the process in the terms 19th century medicine demanded. For his critics, this was sufficient grounds for skepticism. A result without a fully articulated mechanism could be categorized as coincidence, a temporary fluctuation, or an artifact of other changes made at the same time. The absence of a theoretical framework gave the profession a technical objection it could hold in front of the evidence indefinitely. The fifth layer, accepting the evidence, meant accusing the physicians themselves. This is the layer that determined everything else. If Semmelweis was right, then the physicians of the 1st Division had been killing their patients. Not through malice, not through negligence in any conventional sense, but through a routine they performed, without knowing its consequences. A routine that was standard practice, had been standard practice for decades, and was practiced by respected men at respected institutions across Europe. To accept the hand-washing evidence was to accept that some of the most educated, most credentialed, most institutionally privileged practitioners in Viennese medicine had been carrying disease from autopsy room to bedside, that the gap between the two clinics had human agents, and those agents were physicians and students, not bad air. Much of the profession could not absorb this, not because the evidence was weak, because the evidence was too strong, and what it pointed at was themselves. Semmelweis was not ignored. He was actively resisted. His most prominent critic argued that the mortality difference could be explained without implicating physicians. Others attacked the theoretical vacuum, the lack of a named pathogen, as disqualifying. Some raised procedural objections about whether the data had been collected and analyzed correctly. What was notable was not the existence of criticism. Scientific claims attract criticism. What was notable was the character of the resistance, its persistence in the face of accumulating evidence, and its immunity to the results Semmelweis continued to document. He repeated the intervention. The results held. The evidence did not weaken. The resistance did not soften. Semmelweis grew more insistent. His correspondence became sharper. He began writing open letters to prominent obstetricians across Europe, accusing them directly of causing preventable deaths. The tone hardened as the years passed, and the resistance held. In 1865, he was committed to a mental institution. He died there 2 weeks later, at 47. Contemporary records attribute his death to sepsis after a wound to his hand, though the precise circumstances remain disputed. He did not live to see germ theory established. He did not live to see hand-washing become standard practice. He did not live to see the mechanism he could not name finally named and proven. The standard telling of the Semmelweis story centers on one man who was right, and a profession that was wrong. That framing is accurate, but it is not sufficient, because the profession was not simply wrong in the way any individual can be wrong, by missing evidence, making a calculation error, or failing to gather enough data. The profession was wrong in a specific structural way. It organized its skepticism around the conclusion that would have been most damaging to its own identity, and it held that position against evidence that grew stronger over time. This is not the same as ordinary scientific disagreement. Scientific disagreement is supposed to be asymmetric. As evidence accumulates on one side, resistance is supposed to erode. What happened with Semmelweis was the opposite. The evidence accumulated and the resistance hardened, because the evidence was not just a factual claim. It was an accusation. The physicians of Vienna and the broader European medical establishment were not irrational. They were operating inside a system of professional identity that could not easily accommodate the conclusion the data required. A discipline that saw itself as the protector of patients could not rapidly metabolize the information that it had, in effect, become a primary threat. The cognitive distance between I am a healer and I have been spreading disease was too great to cross without a framework that made it structurally safe to admit. Germ theory, when it arrived, provided that framework. Once the pathogen was named and transmission was understood, hand disinfection could be framed as a procedure against an external enemy, microbes, rather than as an admission of guilt by the practitioner. The same evidence, reframed, became easier to absorb. The evidence did not change. The story around it did. Semmelweis died in 1865. By the 1880s, after Pasteur's work on germs and Listerian antisepsis, antiseptic practice was becoming routine in obstetrics. The broader profession was finally moving toward what Semmelweis had demonstrated in Vienna decades earlier. What closed the gap was not better data. The data was always sufficient. What closed the gap was a new theoretical structure that allowed the profession to accept the conclusion without it reading as an indictment. We are accustomed to thinking of scientific and institutional progress as the story of evidence defeating resistance over time. And in a technical sense, that is what happened here. But it took 3 decades. During those 3 decades, the resistance was not ignorance. It was motivated. It was organized. It was expressed in the language of rigor and skepticism by people who were genuinely sophisticated in the methods of their field. The data did not need to become perfect to matter. By 1848, the empirical case was already powerful. What changed, later, was whether the institution could afford to believe it. That is not a failure of evidence. That is a failure of the system that was supposed to evaluate evidence, a system that, in this case, had too much at stake in the wrong answer. The failure was real. The cause chain was longer. Next time, another decision, another moment when the evidence was visible. The cost of believing it was too high, and the wrong answer held.
Specificity and rank define the order, but fragile architecture can't hold water. It's a cascade of forgotten code. A heavy legacy begins to overload. A cascade of affair.